Hello, everyone. This is the Culture and Contemporary Life Talk series, hosted by the Culture section of the American Sociological Association. And in this episode, we are inviting faculty, practitioners, graduate students, and undergraduate students to join in a dynamic conversation with our renowned scholars Richard Sinnett, Ole B. Jensen, and Jack Thornton. This episode will focus on the continuous negotiation of behavior, space, and identity as we navigate public and private spaces in our daily lives. This interdisciplinary dialogue will explore how spaces are not merely physical environments, but are actively shaping who we are, how we behave, and how we connect with others. It's a unique opportunity to link academic inquiry with real world experiences, offering fresh perspectives for faculty researchers, graduate scholars, practitioners, and undergraduate learners alike. We are thrilled to welcome three extraordinary thinkers to help guide this conversation. Richard Sennett is a distinguished sociologist and public intellectual whose work delves into how individuals and communities interact within urban spaces and social structures. His seminal books, The Fall of Public Man, The Craftsman, and Building and Dwelling Ethics for the City, have profoundly shaped our understanding of urban life, labor, and the public realm. Sennett has held esteemed academic positions at the London School of Economics and New York University, earning prestigious accolades like the Hegel Prize and the Spinoza Prize. His work continues to inspire reflection on urbanism, work, and social cohesion. Next, we have Ole B. Jensen, who is a professor of urban theory at Aalborg University in Denmark and co-founder of the Center for Mobilities and Urban Studies. He is a leading voice in urban design and mobility studies and explores how movement, technology, and spatial design shape social life. His influential works include Staging Mobilities and Designing Mobilities, which examine how cities choreograph behavior and how urban design can include or exclude people. He is currently leading the Dark Design Project, which investigates the ethics and impacts of hostile architecture designed to regulate social behavior. And finally, we have Jack Thornton, who is a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Bryn Mawr College. He has a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and his research focuses on the sociology of elites, economic sociology, and education, with an emphasis on how social environment shapes leadership and collaboration. His recent work, Classmates or Colleagues: How Elite Students Learn to Manage One Another, uncovers how elite university students practice uh, workplace like social behaviors through extracurricular activities. Thornton's teaching spans topics like social stratification, space, and environment, encouraging students to analyze the hidden social scripts embedded in the spaces they occupy. And thank you all of you for joining us today. I look forward to an engaging, thought-provoking conversation with our panelists. And this dialogue is meant to inspire meaningful conversations and deepen our understanding of the spaces we inhabit. So thank you all for being here today, and I look forward to our conversation that we have. So we'll start off with Jack in the first question, which is how do you conceptualize the relationship between space and identity? And in what ways do you see space as an active participant rather than just a backdrop for human behavior?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. So for me, in terms of this question, the relationship between space and identity, I think about higher education a lot, and I also think about cities a lot. And so when it comes to the educational trajectory in different places in the US, especially in my context, it's a spatial trajectory. So people are obviously born in a particular place, which may be urban, rural, or suburban. They may or may not move from that place prior to the time they go to college. But then typically when they do go to college, if they go to college, which not everybody does, then that becomes a spatial transformation or a transformation of their spatial context. And so I think that tends to activate spatial awareness if it entails a change. So a common trajectory in Illinois, where I'm from, is for suburban affluent students to go to the flagship university, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, which is going from a suburban or urban adjacent context to like an isolated rural context. And then after that, they may return to the suburbs, but probably not. They're likely to go to a major city, probably Chicago. Maybe if they had left the state and gone to a private university on the East Coast, they would have ended up in New York, which would have activated their regional awareness. So, and during college, they may study abroad, which is going to activate a more global sense of space that they may not have experienced prior to college. So I think that in terms of stratification, people have different spatial trajectories. And then, of course, there's a certain degree of agency for a lot of people in their spatial trajectories. So when you're deciding where to go to college, you're literally deciding where to go. And so then that may or may not influence your choice. Some people may not want to go to a school that's in a rural area, or they may seek out an urban school, like the students that I interviewed at Penn for some of my research in terms of the fact that they had wanted to go to an urban school, which was a common refrain, right? And so then that is going to affect the school's sort of positioning of itself as well as an urban institution. So you can also think about organizational identity at that point. So I would say that that's kind of what I think about for this question.
That's interesting. The back and forth negotiation between space and identity, and not just a one-way trajectory or one-way relationship. And then we'll go ahead and move on to the second question that I have is, and that is, in an era of increasing digital surveillance and shrinking public spaces, how are the boundaries between public and private spaces being renegotiated? Are we losing meaningful public spaces as a result of this digital surveillance and shrinking public space?
Yeah, this is an interesting question for sure. Because I'm not always really sure that we have truly meaningful public spaces in the US in the sense of everywhere is, potentially subject to surveillance and policing and control. Like it's illegal basically to be homeless. So you need to have private space to be like a fully legitimate citizen in the US. But I guess in terms of things like the public space that we think of in terms of being on the train or being at the park or something like that versus our homes, I think that there's increasing surveillance in the private space and there's increasing surveillance in the public space. And I think that means that people may or may not be aware of that, or they may or may not care about that, right? So some people use things on their phone to try to reduce the digital tracking. Like if you have an iPhone, you can change the settings so that you give certain individual apps access to your microphone or your camera or not. And some people may not think that that matters. Some people may feel strongly about that. So if you have an Android and an iPhone, two different phones interacting, there's less security, quote unquote, in that interaction. And so then there's apps like Signal that are encrypted, but then you still never really know like how much you can fully reduce the surveillance that you're under, especially with the rise of, remote work, and just increasing use of Zoom and other things like that. So I think because we are so connected to surveillance technology in the private space and public space, that I don't know if we're necessarily losing meaningful public spaces per se, but that people are not fully aware of the changes in the surveillance that we're experiencing. And so I think that's kind of like an interesting divide between people who care about things like that and are going to use, strategies to protect themselves from surveillance versus people who find that to be not not of concern. But then you have also another group of people who actually invite in the surveillance further, knowingly or unknowingly, with things like Amazon, like Ring cameras or Alexa, like these kinds of devices that are very clearly, used for surveillance that is then used for profit. And that is also something that people may or may not feel personally concerned about.
Which then brings you into maybe another topic of liminal spaces, right? And the in between the virtual environment that is neither in my own room or your room, but instead in a virtual world that is separate or in between from both.
Yeah.
And then we get into design and control of spaces. Who do you think gets to design and control the spaces that we inhabit? And how does that shape our behavior and identity within these spaces? And how do power and authority structures manifest in the organization of space?
hmm Yeah, so something that this question made me think about was something I've studied a bit, which is the relationship between colleges and the locations that they inhabit, especially in urban areas. So over the last 60 or so years, there's been activism, research, organizing, et cetera, related to the role of colleges in the US in gentrification, right? Or expanding their campuses. And so, in the context of Philadelphia, where I live, I think about Penn's role in expanding its campus over West Philadelphia over 100 plus years. But there was intensification in that process in the 60s. And now I compare that to Columbia, which is in New York, which is a similar school, but in a different city that has a different sort of economic structure. There's like a lot more wealth there. And so I think in a relative sense, like Penn has more power in the grand scheme of Philly than maybe Columbia does in the grand scheme of New York. I'm just saying hypothetically we could test that assumption for sure. But my point is that there's different institutions and different kinds of places, and there's different power dynamics in those places. And so obviously there's other universities in Philadelphia that have less power than Penn because they have less wealth. And so this trickles down into the experiences and identities of the students. So Penn and Drexel students may not interact, even though the schools are adjacent to one another, because of these differences in terms of the prestige or the power of institutions, as well as the composition of the students in terms of class and race. So I think that that's one thing that comes to mind. Another thing that comes to mind that I observed recently, so this has happened in other places, but in Philadelphia, there was like this over the last couple of years, there was this proposal to build a stadium in Center City, downtown, essentially. There's a book, it's called Bloomberg's New York by Julian Brash, I believe, and he talks about how they were going to build a baseball stadium in the Lower West Side of Manhattan as part of the bid for the Olympics of the 2012 Olympics, but this was in like 1999 or something like that, and then people protested that, and so they were doing something similar in Philadelphia recently, proposing to build a basketball arena downtown. And the wealthy, powerful billionaires or whatever who were proposing to do that, the people that own the team or whatever, they had one of them had made their wealth off of the campus apartments in the Penn area. So there was sort of like a connection there for me. And they were also, saying, oh, well, we're going to move it to New Jersey if you don't give us these tax benefits or whatever. So, and then what ultimately I think partially led to its downfall was that they were trying to build it in the Chinatown area of Philadelphia, which has a very strong sense of community and to some extent, some money and some power. They're not totally without power. And so, in that case, it was easy to see like these particular individual elites are deciding what this part of the city will look like. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that as well lately and kind of tracing that because it also brought in questions of race and ethnicity because There was, in some instances, like the NAACP in Philly supported the Sixers Arena proposal that would have, negatively affected Chinatown because it would have created jobs, quote unquote, that supposedly would have helped the Black community. So the billionaires were using their claims to have, oh, we're going to have 40% Black workers there, whatever, to try to like stoke this conflict further. So those are the things that came to mind for this question for me.
Yeah, and how to navigate and process. I think of it being as being very Berdousian, right? And how much the habitus that is necessary in order to navigate the field of whether or not these luxury stadiums get built or not built, or where they are built and how they expand, going back to the colleges and universities. And then the final question in the lineup is, how have crises such as COVID-19 reshaped our relationship with space? And today I think beyond COVID-19, I think of things like artificial intelligence and how that may also, and the conversations around artificial intelligence, and how that too may reshape our relationship with space. Um, have they permanently altered our behaviors in public and private realms? Things like COVID-19 and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, what is a crisis? What fits as a crisis for this? There's so many different kinds of crises for sure. COVID is a big one, but I think, I mean, in the US at least, there was like a simultaneous crisis of the quote unquote racial reckoning, the Black Lives Matter movement, which was obviously a global phenomenon in some ways, but largely US driven. I mean, from the perspective of work, COVID-19 it led to the rise of many jobs being remote or hybrid, which now some are saying is kind of being, drawn back a bit, like less employers are trying to get people to go back to work. But of course, the cat is kind of out of the bag, I think, because individual workers can negotiate remote for themselves within their companies, what have you. But I think that that is probably one of the most obvious changes from my perspective is like that kind of fragmentation that resulted from that shock because it made certain kinds of workers at least more mobile. So I think in the early part of the pandemic, which again, some people felt safe, they didn't care really about getting COVID and they were taking trips, and other people felt very apprehensive and were refraining from leaving their house. And so, they're using things like Instacart to get their groceries, which of course is then displacing the COVID risk onto like a more precarious worker generally. So you could think about that, but also people who were sort of like continuing on with their lives relatively quickly after the pandemic began. So, it's March and then in the summer they're like taking trips to Mexico, like or becoming digital nomads, so to speak, in the sense that they have whatever job they have that they can now do from their laptop on the beach in Bali. So why not? And so I guess I'm focusing more on the top of the like socioeconomic spectrum here, but it definitely enhanced certain people's mobility because it created these new possibilities. But then, of course, going back to surveillance, I think that once you're a remote or hybrid worker, you're bringing your work and you're bringing your employer into your home. So they can, see what time you logged onto your computer and whether you sent your email from your phone or not. So then they can make assumptions about whether you were at home where you should be. So there's like this dispersal and like fragmentation, but it doesn't necessarily equate in a straightforward way to greater empowerment among people, I'd say. But it definitely it differentiates people further. So the crises could have that effect, I'd say.
So, as we bring this enriching conversation on behavior, space, and identity to a close, I want to extend a heartfelt appreciation to Jack Thornton today for answering my questions and providing an insightful reflection and compelling ideas as he answered them. The work that he has done has helped illuminate the ways in which ways in which we understand the way space functions, not only as a physical environment, but also as something that is actively involved in the shaping of behavior, identity, and social life. In some ways, I see the built environment and space as being a toolkit that we can grasp onto and use in developing, enhancing, and opening up opportunities for new identities. I also want to recognize and thank all of you as audience members for coming here and spending your time to listen to this conversation. Thank you. Your curiosity and questions are what's going to add to this conversation and add to the meaning and impact of it overall. The Culture and Contemporary Life Talk series is proudly hosted by the Culture section of American Sociological Association. It's a chance for us to explore the pressing social issues of our time through a cultural lens. So before we close, I want to open up the opportunity for a larger conversation. If anyone has a question, please feel free to raise your hand, or I think you should be able to. Um, uh, you actually are not able to unmute yourself, but if you'll raise your hand, then I will unmute you so that you can so that you can talk. Yeah, John.
Yeah, hi. Urban areas certainly have lots of questions, and most universities, no, maybe that's wrong, not most, but a lot of universities are in urban areas, so that's certainly the thing that brings people close to them. I know from my family, if nothing else, that lots of major cities have a housing shortage at the moment. There's certainly a lot of fuss in Boston about trying to create accessible housing. That's one area that's certainly a big thing. Major cities all over the world seem to have a real serious housing shortage at the moment. So that's an interesting aspect of it. Another comment I want to make, a little quick one, is that universities, again, almost maybe a worldwide, at least the countries I know, like the United States and UK, for example, universities are not good neighbors. I don't know there are many universities that are really loved by their neighbors. And one of the reasons for that is they tend to buy out property that's around them, which Jack has mentioned earlier. I think that's a serious thing that makes them hostile. But on the other hand, local businesses and stores certainly benefit a lot from university students. So there always seems to be a bit of a conflict between local people not wanting rental properties to be overpriced, and yet a lot of people benefiting from the presence of students. That's certainly true in Boston, where there are lots of universities here and not always as much support or sympathy from local people. There are things like that which are certainly interesting. Um, a question, just a little negative, no, well, no, just a restricting question, maybe that closes it down a little bit. Um, University, for all its importance, and it is as of shaping your personality and career and everything else, but is it really defining over a lifetime? Could you, I mean, and just sort of a little devil's advocate for a moment, just say, is it something that sort of where you are sort of disappears because people can move quickly to somewhere else, and there's quite a bit of mobility, certainly amongst higher educated people. Academics, for example, travel all over America to pick up jobs or go to grad school or then get work somewhere else. They're very mobile. I've just a few questions. I mean, it's a very interesting topic. There's just a few questions that sprang to mind.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that it is necessarily a long-term impact for the students. I think maybe the students over time have a long-term impact on the place.
Mm.
I think maybe one thing that it could do is change people's perceptions of the places that they went if they were like drastically different. So my undergrad institution was in Iowa, and so there was a fair amount of students who came from New York City or California or something like that. And so there was, for them, I mean, they had to be sort of like already inclined to not reject the school because of that location. If they're, really able to choose and they can afford any school, then there's a lot of schools to choose from. They may leave then from Iowa after college with like a more sympathetic view of like the people in that region, which then having moved to the East Coast, I feel like people write off a lot of, that Midwest and don't really pay attention to it. So I think that going, going into a place and then leaving that place, maybe it's not necessarily that you personally identify with it or that it has too many long-term changes, but I think that it can kind of influence how people perceive other parts of the country. Like in the US, I feel like people in the North often, say like, oh, the South is so terrible and like write it off because of the political like situation in the South. And so then they regard people from those places as problematic in some way or lacking refinement or something like that. And so I think that like through exposure, like prolonged exposure, relatively prolonged, and definitely like filtered exposure to a place and the people there, that can maybe enhance your empathy for those people. But it's possible that that's not the case as well. But that's what I thought about in response to your question.
And that brings up another interesting talk. There was sort of a dichotomous relationship at least historically between rural and urban. It's either rural or urban, and now the conversation tends to be moving from what I've read towards more of a continuum, either being more urban or less urban, more rural or less rural, instead of just being either or. And then I wonder, urban centers and the universities, the cities may rely less on the universities in places like Boston and New York, whereas in rural areas, at least in Iowa, where I too am teaching and went to college, we've already had one university close down and another university in recent years, last year, merge with the net or have plans to merge with another university in the community. And both of these are located in smaller communities, one being Cedar Rapids, the other one in Mount Pleasant. And seeing how they may be a more of a major player for those communities, particularly losing professional jobs where individuals are making uh, larger amounts of money and are contributing greater amount to the economy in those locations, and then not to forget a whole body of students who now no longer are in that community from August until May, and some staying over the summer.
I mean, just a quick comment, I guess, that it does turn out that students are the most highly studied group, I think, certainly by psychologists. And we get, even in sociology, seem to get a lot of discussion from the students where they are and what they've done. So that might, a lot of cases, it balances, pushes our perception up to maybe more higher income, or a lot of them are, have got more choices about where they locate, whether they want to move to the city or from rural areas, or they, that gives us a big, strong sense of those things. But what was the, oh yeah, students do get a lot of studying, but and then the universities too. I mean, as we sort of talking about it now, um, the universities are going to, it seems universities, a lot of them are going to be a lot of financial trouble, particularly with the current administration that's saying that it's going to cut grants to students, for example. I'm not sure whether that's on or off. We don't know with this administration what's happening and what isn't. It's been cancelled again. But that could be really serious for universities and then for the neighborhoods, the cities that they're in, and all the rest of it. I think there's some bigger changes going on at the moment.
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, let's talk something else. That if we're talking about where people choose to locate, and there is a lot of mobility, I think there's quite a bit of personal understanding about whether you feel a lot of community commitment to a community and to, or people who feel a sense of mobility and really want to move around. And then there is certainly a lot for certain cities that have an image that people want to go to. Like people want to go to New York. It's got an image of from TV shows or everything else. Or people want to go to LA, well, all California maybe, but those cities have got chances for their universities and for their people. Um, so there are bigger questions about mobilities of populations and what degrees of whether it's commitment and from personal and local, no, from family and local issues, for example. There's a lot of things, whether people are really committed to community or whether when they go from a smaller community, they don't go back because it lends to a polarization of cities and places so that are doing really well and places that are stuck in uh, underdevelopment where they can't attract populations even to, not just work study but can't attract them for work and new industries and employment and things like that. So there are a lot of big issues going on as well, aren't there?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that mobility is generally like more available to the more privileged people, like in terms
Mm.
of, I think about climate change and just something that I've like studied a bit, not in the context of my research, but in terms of the fact that like, increasing heat and things like that is gonna, make agricultural life more difficult in um, parts of the world where people rely more on that. And so the more privileged, relatively speaking, individuals can migrate, and the others are less able to do so. And so this is going to possibly exacerbate those negative effects by making them most intense for the people that have the least resources. So I think that's sort of a global dynamic that we're seeing as well.
Yeah. Mm. I don't want to stop anyone else from talking. I think I've spoken quite a bit.
Well, one of the things that I think this taps into is, the global cities or the mobility of people to certain places where people want to go, and separating the identity between the visitor or tourist and that of the resident of the local community, and how there may or may not be differences and how they behave within these social spaces, and how they take on an identity and what they see their identity as well as what they see the identity of the city as being. The Iowa State Fair is a popular thing, and maybe in first place sometimes, you know, competing against places like Texas, where they also have a very large state fair. But for tourists, it is a location that people tend to try to get to from all over the United States and all over the world. But for me, having lived here for close to 40 years, as long as I've been able to drive myself there, I don't necessarily go to it every year, just as much as I try to stay away from a large local festival in my hometown of Pella, a local tulip festival. But so it's interesting how I see myself as being different as an Iowa resident as compared to the behavior of newcomers, of tourists.
Hmm. I've been to the Tulip Festival. It's so interesting. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of interesting types of events like the Iowa State Fair or any state fair, which are sort of, I mean, I guess I haven't thought much about this topic, but it is interesting how different states are kind of in competition with one another, like economically, but also in terms of identity. And this often manifests in like sports rivalries, I guess, or maybe that, like, I don't know. It's often within states. You might have Iowa versus Iowa State or something like that. But yeah, but each state has a state fair, right? So you could analyze like how, like, what is a state fair? What is, obviously it serves as type of like boosterism function, promoting the whatever industries are most prominent in that state, I guess. But then also it has this like unifying function for the people there, even if not everybody's going to attend and may want to avoid it, but the people that, enter the like best yodeling contest or whatever, like, or the best, who has the best cow. There was, I don't know what fair it was, but there was like a husband calling contest. I don't know if you ever saw that clip. Like if you look on YouTube, like husband calling contest, and it's like, Steven, like come get your breakfast. And it's like these women like competing, it's a thing, right? Like this is a thing. And so it kind of reinforces, I mean, obviously, whatever state you're in, it's to some degree likely to be in a rural part of the state, I would imagine. I don't know, maybe they're sometimes in cities, but it's kind of a rural phenomenon because it brings in those, agricultural or other like artisanal craft kind of industries that are really not urban, and they're not, it's not like you see, I don't know, finance or tech at the state fair, and to the degree that you might, see them in the city. Their impact is more urban. So industries are also on this urban, rural, suburban spectrum too. So that's actually interesting to think about.
Um,
Sorry about that.
by That's all right. By zooming in and looking at and focusing on the mobile situation or the social situation, if we want to call that, as the unit of analysis. So I'm looking mostly in my empirical work in my field studies. I'm looking at what people do, the practices in situated environments around the world. So I'm looking at train stations and shopping malls, street spaces, all kinds of spaces. And from that point of departure, the situation is sort of unpacked. And over the last couple of years or more, I've been using the notion or the concept of affordance quite efficiently to understand the relationality between space and human practice, so that we understand exactly that space or the environment or the built environment as it is not a backcloth, but it's actually a co-agent. It's a material co-constituency of social agency, as we start unpacking what is going on the ground. So I think to answer the question, sort of, or sum it up, is that the relationship between space and social or human behavior is one of mutual interdependency, and one of where the options or the actions made possible by the material design is one of relationality, so that when we have particular infrastructures or particular material layouts, those enable or prevent particular practices. And so there's a question of human appropriation and taking on the environment as it were, but also there's a level of semiotic interpretation, basically understanding what is possible here, what's doable. Some relying on experiences, some relying on situated readings as you go along on the fly, as it were. So on that level, I tend to look very much on the situations and try to unpack them. And then of course the wider questions about identity is more a question, I think, about scales as well. You have nation territories that you can think about in terms of identity marks. You can also have the question much more related to places of home and belonging, to neighborhoods, to those sorts of, where territory becomes or space becomes identity markers, so to speak, in these sort of negotiation processes of understanding, or marking out who you, if it's on an individual level, who you are, or on a collective level, how you affiliate and how you congregate around these the spatial dimensions.
What I'm hearing is that material in its purest form is raw, but we give it meaning, and its design gives it certain affordances to be more or less of what the meaning we give it, and that's where it gains meaning and starts to negotiate that meaning with the human alongside the human hand.
Yes.
So my next question is, in an era of increasing digital surveillance and shrinking public spaces, how are the boundaries between public and private spaces being renegotiated? Are we losing meaningful public spaces as a result of this digital surveillance and potentially shrinking public space?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting question. I think the Israeli historian Yahari talks about the Cilician Wall, the division line going actually through our cell phones and media that we have in our pockets, as much as in the territory as you progress or move around in the city, walled off and so forth. So I think there's a very complex set of relationships here around the digital surveillance techniques, both the ones that we carry with us as mobile devices, but also the ones that are enabled through closed circuit televisions or drones footage, various types, but also the ones that are related to the digital traces that we leave with our phones and our apps and our whereabouts. So I think there's a kind of, I think of it as an overlayering. So we still have the classic sort of means of surveillance of public space, eyes on the street, various ways in which you can police or survey an area. And then we have this overlaying of digital systems of surveillance technologies. And those touch points and handshakes are kind of complicated, but also very interesting in terms of how that sort of mediates the relationship between public and private spaces. I think whether we're losing meaningful public spaces it's, I don't know. I mean, I think there is a risk, of course, in terms of um, philosopher Mike Walzer talked about single-minded and open-minded spaces at some point, and this idea that single-minded spaces are okay for dedicated instrumental purposes, but if we have too much of it, it becomes kind of like a colonization. And I think in the research we've been doing on public space and the way in which design is excluding homeless people in homelessness, I think we see a tendency for, I mean, like we had this with this very simple diagram of the number of public benches and the number of cafe chairs in Copenhagen, and you can see that the number of public accessible benches are falling, and the number of cafe chairs is increasing, and of course that has something to do with the monetization and privatization of public spaces. So in that respect, there's a movement in certain areas, at least in terms of loss, if you want to sort of take on that conversation. But I think in terms of digitalization, it's pretty complicated. The former conversation, or the old conversation we had about the digital divide, is definitely not gone away, but rather being accentuated in the populations related to people in homelessness. At least in Denmark, where the mobile technology is absolutely crucial for citizens to interface with the whole regulatory system of government bodies, and that's a huge issue. Not being able to have a bank account, not being able to actually have it through an app or interface, citizen services through apps is a big issue. So in that respect, I think there's something going on that pushes in that direction.
And then I think about technology and whether it strongly represents who we are. I think of closed circuit television, and a human eye may not be the best, or has been found in the past to not be the best witness when being admitted into court because the human eye may miss something or see something as a result of personal bias. So closed circuit television and whether that's a true representation of really what's taking place there in almost a third space in some ways, a liminal space that is separate between, here and there. And then, cell phones, which the algorithm is that a true representation of who we are and who uses this technology and do others sometimes use our accounts and yeah, that brings on a whole nother bag of mess for the conversation.
True. Yeah, absolutely.
And then I want to go on to design and control of the spaces that we inhabit. Who is it that gets to design and control these spaces that we inhabit, and how does that shape our behavior and identity? How does power and authority manifest in the organization of space?
Yeah, and another large topic, we might say. I think what we're realizing when we're studying urban spaces and the built environment in general, is the presence of multiple stakeholders and many different types of interests, the co-presence of that. Um, Jane Jacobs talked about organized complexity, or this idea that the city is an entity of many agencies, as it were, and the built environment, and there's a certain, I mean, there's a historic dimension to it, obviously, but also there's a contemporary, co-presence of many different entities that control. And of course, that depends also how we sort of respond to that inquiry. It depends very much also on where we are in the world, because we have different types of regulatory regimes. We have different ways in which government bodies and private interests are able to play out in mutual relationships. Many years ago, I was quite taken by the American phenomenon of business improvement districts as a way of dealing with what you in political science would call state failure. And that for me I was actually, if I can be just slightly anecdotal here, I was walking up Fifth Avenue, and I was at the Graduate School of Planning and Preservation at Columbia as a visiting scholar. And there was something odd, I thought, and I just returned, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then I just went up to Columbia, to the coffee room, and I was having a chat with a colleague, and I said, this odd thing just happened. I walked up the street, and there was something weird just in that space. And then I sort of started. She said, "So what was that?" Well, the litter boxes were the same, and the light posts were kind of the same, and all that sort of weird. And oh, that's a bit, he said. And I said, what's a bit? Well, that's a business improvement district. And so I got into that understanding, of how private corporations and enterprises can actually, take over certain dimensions of what we, from a European point of view, would think of would be highly, state type of government, or state type of task, clean streets, security, all that, the amenities, and taking care of the urban furniture and all that stuff. So what I'm trying to say is that we find the co-presence. So who decides? And when we did our research, or when we still do some research on exclusion of homeless people, one of the conversations we have is very much related to, is it a fully private space? Is it fully public? It's a kind of semi-public. We have a long conversation with the Danish Rail, because a lot of the benches that are modified so that people in homelessness can't sleep on them are positioned in these sort of public accessible main train stations and stuff like that, or outside them. But it's still an agency that works. We have very strong law enforcement rules. We have a prohibition against begging. We have a prohibition against camping on the street. So the police will enforce those regulatory frameworks, but they are often called upon by citizens or private owners or developers. So you have this kind of, when you hit the street, basically you see the co-presence of many different stakeholders and many different types of institutions playing out. So that doesn't mean that responsibility or ethics goes away, but it means that it's hard to pinpoint always exactly who's actually running and deciding and who has the power in this particular place. It's very often a composition of many stakeholders and many interests.
Interesting. And then I think of public and private and time playing into this as well. I think of historically in the United States and looking at Jim Crow law era and
Mm.
sundown
Yeah.
towns and areas where people could be at certain times, but other times it was forbidden. Or
Mm.
maybe in downtown spaces today where young children are forbidden, but older adults are openly allowed. Or my area of research in looking at bar spaces and about 6 o'clock in the evening is when children are to leave. But prior to that, they can be there and participate in games and eat food and soda and things like that
Mm.
until it is a space only for adults, people 21
Mm.
and older.
Yeah.
And now we look at outside forces beyond the institution, particularly looking at things like COVID-19 that have reshaped our relationship with space. And have you noticed anything in terms of how such a crisis has reshaped our relationship with space? And has it permanently altered our behaviors in these public and private realms?
Well, it's kind of interesting that you asked that question because when I was right now, there's been this, well, anniversary is maybe a bad term, but this 5 year sort of time has passed since a lot of, at least in the Danish government, closed down a lot of activities in Danish public spaces. And so there's been a lot of sort of recapping going on in the media, and a lot of people will tell the stories. And do you remember? And it's kind of this weird thing that some people think, oh, it's ages ago, and other people are still sort of marked by it and have these kind of very vivid memories of incarceration and to some people also quite psychologically challenging after effects of it. Um, when in 2020 when that thing happened in Denmark, I remember distinctly a lot of colleagues saying, "Oh, this is important. We're going to do a lot of research on that." And I thought, "Nah, I'm not gonna. That's not gonna affect me." And I ended up writing a book together with some colleagues on COVID and that whole restructuring. And I think the moment where I realized that something was going on was I was to be anecdotal slightly again, I went into the city with some food for my daughter who lives in a flat there and couldn't, the PM went on television saying, "Oh, whatever you do, please don't rush to the stores and buy all kinds of stuff." And that was like pressing a button, and everybody went to the stores and bought a lot of stuff. So that was, I think, one lesson in crisis control and management. So I went in and I drove through a totally empty city, and it was really weird. And I had this kind of experience of in there is this Danish kids book or children book which is called Palle Alone in the World or Palle Alene i Verden, which is kind of like it's an odd sort of eerie story about this kid who wakes up and suddenly there's no one in the city, and he goes on the trolley and goes around. And in the beginning it's kind of fun, right? But it becomes more and more sort of, where's everyone around? And it's sort of really an evil, nightmarish kind of thing, right? And I think, that was the first thing, right? And then accounts starting beeping in, of wildlife coming into, public spaces, and it's sort of everything was out of order, and you could see the decrease in traffic, of course, and you could have all these conversations. So I thought maybe there was something sociologically important anyway in this phenomenon. And we had a long conversation when I edited a book with Nikolai Schultz, another sociologist. And I remember a conversation we had with another colleague in sociology who thought that, "Oh, you can't do this right now because it's going on, right?" And we are like, "Well, why can't we do it while it goes on?" No, no, no. We study stuff afterwards. And we said, no, 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 no. So we had this interesting conversation about whether you can actually study transformation and change as it takes place, or whether you should wait for the archives and everything to sort of solidify into the sort of data that we often work with. And obviously we went for the former strategy and insisted that you could actually talk about these things. Um, and yeah, in public spaces and in pop mobilities, which is where I do my activities, it was quite evident that everything was grinded and stopped and orchestrated. I also we had a couple of rounds of closing and opening, and then at the second round, I wrote a paper for mobilities where I was thinking about the more sort of micro scale detailing of some of these enforcements, like for instance the notion of social distance, which some people think is an invention of the Danish PM, but it's not. I mean, Ed Hall studied it, and we in all cultures you have different types of distance depending on your relationality to other people. And so I started looking at how people were policing the striping up of public spaces and were trying to commenting on one another. And there was like all these sort of turn takings. Some people in Denmark, we had some people think we were very too compliant. So the PM says, "Oh, jump," and we'll say, "How high?" Right? And or here's a stripe, you can't go beyond it. And so there was this kind of where in other countries in Europe and also in the US, of course, there was this question about whether that authority was actually legitimate, whether you could actually control people's bodies to that extent. So on that note, there was some interesting things going on. But when I wrote this piece for mobilities, I started sort of thinking about the I think what was there already, but which was much more exaggerated and much more clear because of the social distance regulations. So I realized that all situations have this kind of elasticity to them, right? They have it, you shout at people, you nod at people. I mean, I'm coming from government and social interaction,
Yeah.
so it's already there. But because of I mean, like in Copenhagen, there are three famous lakes where people like to run around and drive around on their bikes. They're simply just called the lakes. And the police got into trouble there because there was too many people there because everybody was sent home from work and they just wanted to jog and run around. And at some point it was like crazy. So they made a one directional route. So, and then they started talking about how close could you be to one another. In the pedestrian streets of Aalborg, I think that was the first city in Denmark where we had a striping up of the pedestrian streets with big yellow tape. And so you had to go hold on your right. So in order to avoid the interesting thing was that COVID is an aerosol, right? So it's in the air, so it swirls around. And the big issue was I did some inquiry into that through some medical research from Belgium, and the actual distance that you need to have is a function of the speed your body moves. So that means if you're driving on a bike lane, you actually need a very, very long distance to be safe from that aerosol. And that was not practically doable. So there was and it was also interesting to see that in Europe, at least there were like, I think Holland had 1.5 meters, we had 1 meters, other had 2 meters. So you have this kind of variations to it. So situations are elastic and bodies are extended. So I wrote this paper the extended body literature is not something I invented. It's already there. But trying to capture these ideas to understand not just what this was a state of exception, but also that this was a window into how we normally move around in the city, but maybe without really paying so much attention to it. So I ended up having to eat my own words in the sense that the COVID was definitely relevant to sociology, and I spent a lot of time actually looking at it.
Well, yeah, and then your other area of geography, and I think about, COVID-19 and applying both to geography and sociology. We know from sociology that we are very social beings, and when that is taken away from us, it makes it quite difficult to be able to be human.
Mm.
And in geography, and particularly when I'm thinking about spaces and the inhabitants of those spaces, if something is empty and there is nothing there, then there must be something going on with that geographic area, that geographic region, whether it's pollution or something else that prevents it from being inhabited by even, plant forms or other life forms.
That is true, and I think both the now pretty famous Danish architect Jan Gehl, but also William White and other people who've been working on Lindelof, and a lot of people have, realized that the prime attraction in public spaces are the people, right?
Well, this was my final question for the lineup. And I just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Jensen for bringing an enriching conversation to our talk on behavior, space, and identity as we bring it to a close. I also want to extend a heartfelt appreciation to all of our guests today who showed up to listen and to, I hope, also ask questions here in a moment and to participate and engage in a much larger dialogue. So at this point, I will go ahead and open it up to any questions that our audience has. If you will please raise your hand or use the virtual raising of your hand, I will unmute you.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Antje Gimmel. I'm from Aalborg University, and I know Ole B and Ole's work. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
But I know the book about COVID-19 you edited together with Mark. And you said now it was difficult to do that while this was going on. Was there something special you learned by doing it in a different way, not waiting until all the archives have the data and you can, was it a different way of working with this topic?
Well, hi, Angie. Thank you so much for that question. I think I mean, it was definitely an interesting conversation we had with some of the contributors. The book was a composition of, actually, we thought, Nikolai Schulz and myself, when we edited, that people would be drawing out old work and pulling it into chapters, right? But because people were sitting at home and really had not much to do, they actually wrote fresh entries for the book. And so I think the first interesting moment was this critique or reluctance by one of the authors to engage because he thought it was eventist, I think was his terminology of it. This idea that, it sort of becomes too much of a sort of an attention given to, and maybe an over exaggeration of the moment, as it were, right? And so there was this kind of concern, and I think that leaned onto some interesting conversations, at least between the two, me and Nikolai as editors. Can we do this? Does it make sense? Can you actually study society as it moves in front of you, as it changes, or do you have to wait? And I think well, if Nikolai hears this, maybe he could correct me, but I think we had different sort of iterations around that kind of question, both practically as editors, but also more sort of epistemologically as sociologists. What does this mean? Can we actually, do we have to wait it out? And so I think very low practically, it meant that people would rely on, well, I did a bit of ethnographic stuff on the street and stuff, but otherwise a lot of people worked more on, there was statistics on various things, and of course they were not like super fresh, but I think it was more like conceptually thinking about what does this mean for family life, for work life, what does it mean for, for the economy, the sort of very early on we could see statistic. I mean, in my chapter, I have some very fresh statistics on the number of airport passengers in Copenhagen Airport being like sky falling out of the sky, basically, right? So that data was accessible, but also, of course, some others couldn't get fresh data for that sort of thing. So it'd be more like conceptual questions about what is what does COVID-19 suggests about society. And I guess one of the big questions that were raised along the road, not just in our book, but in general, was this seems to be not just a crisis, but also an opportunity. Many of the problems that we identify in the scientific community as leading to climate change and environmental issues seem to be, if not stopped, then at least paused. And that opened up a conversation about whether this was actually a political route that you could take. Does this mean that you could actually think about stopping these activities and then saving the environment and the globe, right? And then, of course, immediately other people say, yeah, but that means like stop breathing, right? So, and then we had these kinds of political conversations about that. Very early on, they were also in the media, at least in Denmark. In Denmark, there were two types of reactions. There was these people saying, "Oh, it's going to go away. Don't worry, everything's going to come back to the same." And other people would say, "No, no, no, this is changing things forever, right? This is never going to be the same." And I guess somewhere in the middle is probably where we landed now. Something has changed. Other things, are back to normal. And I think even the tourism right now is higher than it was during COVID, right? So I think for on different levels we engage this conversation about whether you can but I think methodologically it's an interesting conversation whether you can actually obviously we ended up arguing that you can study change as it happens, right? But it's an interesting and I'm not sort of 100% sure that it's without issues.
The fact that we are here now online, I think that also has been
Yeah,
made possible by.
yeah,
Otherwise, I think people would be very reluctant to go into this kind of online event.
that is true. That is true. Yeah.
My initial knee-jerk reaction was ethnography, but it's kind of difficult to go out and study social spaces that tend to be, empty of people. And across the United States, from one state to the next, it would vary in terms of where people were able to go when they were able to go there. And then I was thinking of David Altidy from Arizona State and looking at content analysis and looking at how COVID-19 was framed through media, which would be another. But is that a true? Is that nothing more than a representation of what's going on rather than what's going on? After all, it is a small lens and only a very small frame of the overall public and how a certain person's experience as good as compared to the overall whole.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think the represent. I mean, I think also. Well, I we had, if I can just refer to another conversation we had a philosopher that has been writing extensively, a Danish philosopher was writing extensively on virus and vira and isolation, that whole kind of the hygienic sort of discourse and all that from the medieval ages, medieval times and until today. And I remember vividly when I was trying to persuade him to join as an author, he said, "Well, there's nothing new here. I mean, it's just this is it's an epidemic and it happens, right?" And I remember I don't know if that was the only argument that got him on board, but after I said, "Yeah, but this is the first time we had a virus traveling with 800 kilometers an hour," and then he sort of said, "Why? Well, yeah, you got something." And then so I think media and transportation was very important. Dynamics that differed from, say, 500 years ago when you had an epidemic, right? So the distance or the speed of dissemination, basically, is one thing, and the reporting and the mediatization, the instant awareness and the instant sort of both for good, like getting ideas about, oh, you can stand on your balcony and sing. Oh, let's do that because they did in Italy, right? But also you could start making questions. You could be vax. You could do all these kinds of things, gaining momentum in this in SoMe sphere, right? So, I mean, it's a double-edged sword in that kind of sense, right? So I think we had some in terms of media, but also in terms of technology. I think that was in Europe we had this very well documented case of people going after skiing in Austria and Switzerland, and then back to the air plates and going up to northern part of Europe with the virus, right? So it spread very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think of I believe it's Barbara Adam and timescapes and
Hmm.
understanding moments and cycles and I think that there are ever more moments, but those moments are ever more energized in a time where time has sped up, or at least if it's experienced as if it has sped up.
Yeah.
Oh, one moment. There we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you very much, Ole Jensen. I'm just absorbing and enjoying all of it, and I guess I have a lot of questions, but what I'm very interested in is how you address this composition of the designers, this you say there's multiple at stake, and then the relationship to or the nexus, addressing the planning level and the social identity or the personal identities. What interests me here is it just a question about this emergence or the potentials in all that is at stake and the collaborations, or can we be more clear about the organizational level of the planning and the design level, and then the identities, and I leave that open to you how you define identity, because there are place identities and there are personal identities, there are group identities, so there are many levels of and scales of how you approach the identities. But what I find so fascinating is this nexus between the planning level, the collaborations, the organizations around these decision-making processes, and then what you deal with when you actually address identities. So, and this is a soft or I ask for you for your interpretation, and yeah.
Oh yeah, thank you. I mean, that's that. I mean, for one thing, at least in the sort of line out of questions, I guess we can start, as you say, we can start having a conversation about whether these are personal identities, social identities, collective identities, place-oriented identities, or how should we, think about that? And what does it mean? I mean, identity on its own is a huge kind of topic, right? I think Giddens back in the 90s said that it's the capacity to keep a story of I going, right? So this sort of self-identity, and this sort of narration dimension to it. Of course, there are many different things to it, but I think what I'm interested in is how we utilize, not necessarily instrumentally or even consciously, but how we relate to our surroundings and the built material environment, and how that affects who we think we are and how we relate to other people, right? So right now I'm sitting in the suburb in a villa overlooking, and I can see, expensive cars parked outside and stuff like that. So there are different props that you can utilize to show, in a Bourdieuian kind of sense, distinction and that sort of thing, and where you utilize some of that. But there's also the way in which you move around in the city and the way in which you appropriate spaces. And I think that our work with people in homelessness and the way in which they have been addressed by exclusionary interventions is quite interesting. Because in our research, we sort of thought about if those elements communicate to people, right? I mean, the bench on a nice park communicates, it makes the affordance, it makes a gesture. Have a seat, right? So the leaning bench or the punctuated or the spikes communicates the opposite, right? Go away, move along. And if they are in public spaces extensively, what they do is a kind of a citizen or identity denial, right? That you're actually not allowed to be here, you're not allowed to be around. And so I'm saying this to sort of try to get at, this relationality between, the material fabric and the way in which it's designed and how we think of ourselves as individuals, but also how we relate in collectives, right? The appropriation of public space, whether it's designed for, commercial interaction around cafe tables, or whether it's, much more an open green space that you can just sit on, without any strings attached and so forth. So I think those are all kind of I'm sort of coming back to my point of departure, which is the mobile situation or the actual situations where people are moving around in the city and being present, trying to unpack that in some elements of materiality and sociality, and also embodiment and how people are relating to that. And of course, some of that comes from elsewhere in terms of strategies and plans and architecture and decisions outside of our making. You know, when I'm looking down the street out of my window now, it's there. It has a particular curvature. It has a sort of a topography. I didn't decide anything of that. I bought this house, but someone, made that whole thing, and I can sort of get into it. And so there is this question of temporality and experience. So you come into spaces, you come into relations with others and with space, right? And if you're a newcomer, the tourist, right? Everything is maybe exciting and or you might be well known to your surroundings, so you feel comfortable, you know exactly what to do and where to go and stuff like that. And then when we're working with the people in homelessness, that's like suddenly someone in the municipality or the police or whatever decides that this used to be your living room, but now it's gone, right? It's elsewhere, right? Because the difference between us with a sedentary home in a coordinate and then people in homelessness is that they have, they sleep one place, they brush their teeth in another place, they socialize in a third place, they do all, so they're living in this sort of a network where the decision of, whether it's there or not is not really theirs. And I'm sort of just trying to use that as a reference to some research we've been doing, but to say that the relationship between the spaces or the material fabric and our practices and who we are and how we think about ourselves is very much, sort of a combination between things we can choose and things we do and things that are given. And some of it is relatable to larger, things like, gentrification, neoliberal capitalist kind of, transformation of public spaces, and others are, much more, a matter of I'm going to go for a walk and I'm going to go that way, not that way, and so it's a complicated issue, but it's I think that if you're starting from the situation and try to unpack it into these sort of elements, and this is stuff that is related to the book Staging Mobilities that I wrote some back in 2013, which is one way of trying to get at, how people are positioned in spaces. I hope I sort of tangentially answered your questions.
And you did, and it's I will read it. What I guess I'm thinking about, if we got the time, is there time for, yeah?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay. That is I'm very interested in the design process, and I'm a sociologist myself, and I recently interviewed an urban designer, and he's actually a sculptor, and he delivered on Israel's the Plaza of Israel. It's called. It's very close to the city center in Copenhagen. And what fascinated me about his work was when did he do or when did he take choices that he felt right about in order to embrace the diversity, and you talked about the as a public space, right? So and there was one place in the square that where they suggested, the architect and urban designer suggested that there should be a shelter. And the municipalities then went in and said, yeah, this might not be the best choice because, the homeless, it would sort of not, that's not what we are hoping for. They would stay too long. So it's actually interesting. How are these decisions made from an aesthetical point of view, from a material point of view, from a political point of view, where we deal with so many interests, and it feels as this is about sort of, in my perspective, this is about some kind of a knowledge hierarchy, some kind of right, a political, aesthetical, political right to claim. So these are the best solutions in order to uh, make space for a public that is a common good, and this interpretation of this common good in this public space is what's what keeps me awake. What do you have to say about that?
No, but I mean, I was just resonating to some of the things that you said, because I'm a sociologist and I've been working with architects and designers for plus 25 years, and not just working with, but actually taking on a lot of ideas. And I recently I published a paper in Transfers, thinking about, it was actually the legacy of John Urry kind of thing, but I was thinking about the way in which I've been engaging with designers and architects and what it means for my version of sociology. And I've sort of, I mean, to be a little crude, I would say as a sociologist, you are trained to spot problems, right? Who did it, and power, all that stuff. And so a sociologist walks into a space and he says, so who decided this and that and so forth? An architect, in a caricature kind of way, walks in and says, why is this not something else, right? So this sort of inborn impetus to look for for transformation and to look for change, to look for potentials. I was brought up learning about problems. I was never brought up learning about potentials. So over the years, what I've been thinking in terms of the version of sociology that I practice is that there's something in both of it. So the rigor and the theoretical sort of way in which sociology has something to say about power and identity, what happens in between people. We shouldn't get rid of that, but maybe we could start looking at how designers and architects approach the world, to start looking for this could be something else, and that's a very different very different mindset. And I've been stealing from my colleagues and from the students shamelessly over the years to try to massage this into some kind of structural way of thinking about it. And so, I think there's something about the way in which, when you look at how designers make decisions about just right, what to do, right? That partly is black boxed in terms of creativity and, those sorts of things, but also is related very much to what Donald Schoen showed us many years ago, reflective practitioners work, right? Doing things, knowing it, a pragmatic way of figuring, that doesn't gonna, we know rule of thumb and all that stuff. And so next to that, I think what I also took from architects and designers, particularly when I work in urban spaces, is this very much more granular vocabulary for talking about materials, voids, shades, space, materials, how it's, sensorial stuff that we don't really learn in sociology. We're pretty we talk about material, it's kind of abstract. When designers talks about, microclimate, shade, and it's very clear when we do our work on people in homelessness that, looking for shelter, it's all about what your vulnerable, fragile, soft body does up against the hard stone city and the climate and the water and the wind and all that stuff. Looking for shelter, flying out, microclimatic conditions. So you start understanding, but also on a sunny day in a public park, how shade and light and all that, or turbulence at the foot of a large building, all these sorts of things. So I think the potential and the material vocabulary are two of the things that I've been trying to incorporate into my sociological thinking as a way of sort of learning from architects and designers. But I agree. I mean, there's also black boxes. There are also, there's like when we had this conversation about exclusionary design and these benches and stuff, there was a lot of people. I remember the first time I presented my paper in my research group, an architectural colleague of mine said, well, surely that's the developers, right? So that this monkey tough thing was already taking place, and there's an ethical conversation about which becomes complicated because there are so many different agencies and stakeholders. So you can quite easily say, well, it's not really, is it police or is it government? Is it parliament?
Right.
Who has it, right? And what's the role of the designer and architect who just, contributes with something like a bench, right? But I think I assume that you know of Øyvind Larsen's work. He was a philosopher working at the Business School of Copenhagen, and he wrote this piece, Den lydige forvalter, the obedient servant or the civil servant, and after a political scandal in Denmark many years ago. So this question about whether you can, get out of ethical responsibilities, by just, obedience. And obviously this is Stanley Milgram was one of his cases. And, so I think there's some interesting things going on when you start looking at who actually decides and who has the power, right? So even though there are good things to say about what we can learn, there's also, issues where we need to apply our sociological critique or critical sense, as it were. Sorry, I hope that was sort of somewhere along the lines.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think of Goffman also in front stage, backstage. I think Goffman gets at the heart of that interaction and the tools that people
Yeah.
use, yes, in their environment. Probably one who is maybe before his time, and although I think later on and Purdue and others as well, maybe even getting into a bit of that with habitus and field and then even doxa, like almost natural behavior within people's natural spaces. But this is all great content. This is all. I think this is the area where sociology has an opportunity to advance. We talk about, where else can sociology advance? It's advanced in a lot of different areas, but I think this is one area where it's still in its adolescence. So, adolescent years.
Yeah, I mean, I am very much inspired and I'm very pro Goffman, but I think also if I have to be critical of Goffman, I think one of the problems or one of the things that I would suggest as a critique or a revision is this idea that the spatial is a backcloth, that the
Yes.
spatial is, something secondary or that it's like, and that comes a little bit with this dramaturgical or scenographic metaphor, right? That it's sort of the social and then there's the stuff in behind. But actually, I think in today with inspiration from A&T and new materialism and different kinds of ways of problematizing sort of human agency on its own, I think we would have to include artifacts, technologies, and spaces much more equally into, and there I think government still has the sensitivity to the dynamics of the situations, and particularly this idea of looking at stuff that everybody agrees is nothing. Then there's something to it, right?
Yeah.
But I think precisely this thing about the background of architecture is probably where I would fix Goffman a little bit.
Any other questions today? We are coming close to the end, but I have room for one more question if there is one. All right. Well, in closing, this has been another episode of the Culture and Contemporary Life Talk series, a series that is hosted by Culture Section of American Sociological Association. And I want to say one more time, thank you all for coming, and please be on the lookout on our social media to learn about the upcoming 2 more episodes yet this academic year. So thank you.
Thank you very much.